Welcome to the deep dive. We sift through the sources so you get the insights. And today, well, we're tackling a pretty big question, maybe even a bit unsettling. What if the folks we elect aren't the ones actually making the final decisions? We're going to explore some theories and actually a really fascinating study about who might really be in control.
That's right. We're diving into this idea of a shadow government. Sometimes people call it an invisible government or even a secret government.
Hmm.
And the core idea behind these theories is that, the real political power, it isn't held by our elected representatives. Instead, it's supposedly with these highly influential people operating behind the scenes completely outside of democratic controls.
Right. So, our mission today is to really unpack the sources you brought, pull out the main ideas, and try to get a handle on this concept. We'll touch on conspiracy theories, sure, but also, surprisingly, some actual scientific research looking into economic control. Okay, so this term, shadow government, it immediately paints a picture, doesn't it? But let's get specific. What's the actual hypothesis here? What are they claiming, and who are these supposed hidden players?
Fundamentally, the hypothesis is that elected officials are, well, subordinate. They answer to this hidden power structure. And the theories name different groups. Central banks, for instance, powerful lobbies, think tanks are mentioned often.
Huh.
Also really wealthy interests, sometimes called globalist elites, even supranational organizations. The claim is they manipulate politics, either for their own gain or maybe for some larger hidden agenda the public isn't aware of.
And, you can't really talk about this without the name Illuminati popping up. That's a big one in popular culture. How does that fit into these theories? Is it just modern folklore or?
Yeah, the Illuminati definitely looms large in modern conversations about this. It's
Yeah.
often described as this uh, alleged secret society, kind of the power behind the throne,
Yeah.
supposedly controlling world events through existing governments, corporations. And yeah, it often gets linked to plots about establishing a so-called New World Order.
Right. And these ideas, the Illuminati included, they've spread quite a bit through what gets called conspiracy theory literature.
Yeah.
You mentioned some key writers and the sources who push these ideas forward.
Yes, exactly. People like Dan Smoot, William Guy Carr, Jim Marrs, Carol Quigley is another name, Gary Allen, Des Griffin, David Icke, Michael A. Hoffman II, John Coleman. These are authors often cited in this genre, let's say.
And what about specific organizations? The sources you looked at named quite a few institutions these writers often point to.
They did. The lists usually include influential groups like the Council on Foreign Relations or CFR, the Trilateral Commission, the Bilderberg Group, Chatham House, the World Economic Forum. Then you have major international bodies, the EU, the UN, the WHO, NATO gets mentioned. And of course, a huge focus is on financial power. So international banks, the World Bank, the IMF, the Bank for International Settlements, or BIS, and even giant investment firms like BlackRock, Vanguard, and Blackstone are frequently named.
Okay, wow. That's quite a list of potential players in these shadow government narratives. It does sound very theoretical, almost like a spy novel plot. But then you show this really interesting study, something more empirical. It seems to suggest there might be something to the idea of concentrated power, at least economically. Let's get into that.
Yes, exactly. It shifts the ground a bit.
Yeah.
This study came from three complex systems theorists at the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich, ETH, Zurich. And their starting point was basically asking, could a small, really interconnected group of global players actually control global finance and commerce? They wanted to see if the network structure showed that.
That sounds like a massive task. I mean, mapping global finance. How did they even approach that? What was their method?
It was definitely ambitious. They analyzed the relationships between, get this, 43,000 transnational corporations. To do it, they used a database called Orbis 2007, which apparently listed around 37 million companies and investors globally at that time. So from that huge pool, they pulled out 43,060 transnational companies and then painstakingly mapped out who owned shares in whom. And based on that, they built this model showing control through shareholding networks, and they factored in operational income too to get a map of economic power.
Okay, so they crunched the numbers on a massive scale. What did they actually find? Were the results as dramatic as some of these theories suggest?
Well, they were pretty startling, actually. They found what they called a core of 1,318 companies. These were all deeply tangled up in terms of ownership. Each one in that core had ties to two or more other companies, but the average was about 20 connections each.
20 connections.
Yeah. And here's the really interesting part. Those 1,318 companies, they only accounted for about 20% of global revenues directly. But through all their shares, they collectively seem to own large parts of the world's biggest manufacturing firms, the real economy, as the researchers put it. and that accounted for another 60% of global revenues.
Wow, so a small group leverages massive influence through ownership.
Exactly. But it got even more concentrated. They pinpointed a super entity within that core, just 147 companies, even more tightly knit. Their ownership was almost entirely held by other members of that same super entity, like a knot in the center. And this tiny group, these 147 companies, controlled 40% of the total wealth flowing through the entire network.
40% from just 147 companies.
40%. James Gladfelder, one of the authors, basically said less than 1% of companies control 40% of the entire network. And maybe unsurprisingly, most of these are financial institutions. The top 20 included names you'd recognize like Barclays, JP Morgan Chase, Goldman Sachs.
Ah, okay, hold on. Less than 1% controlling 40% of the network's wealth. That's huge. So what's the main takeaway here? Does this study prove a conspiracy, or is it telling us something else about how the global economy is structured? What are the real implications?
Right, that's the crucial question. The researchers themselves and others like John Driffel, a macroeconomics expert who commented on it, they don't necessarily frame it as proof of a deliberate conspiracy. It's more about understanding systemic risk and stability. Driffel pointed out that the analysis is valuable just for showing how interconnected and potentially fragile the system is. The Zurich team was quite nuanced. They said, look, this concentration of power isn't automatically good or bad, but, and this is a big but, the extreme interconnectedness within that core is potentially dangerous. If one key company in that superentity gets into trouble,
It could spread like wildfire through the whole system.
precisely, it creates this immense systemic risk. So even without intentional manipulation, you have a structure where shocks can propagate incredibly fast and wide. It's like an accidental oligarchy almost, highly sensitive to problems within that tiny core.
What a fascinating journey. We started with theories, almost folklore in some ways, about hidden hands, and ended up looking at hard data showing a remarkable concentration of economic power, even if it's not necessarily directed by a secret committee. It really does give you pause.
It certainly does. And maybe the question for you listening is this. Knowing about these networks, whether the alleged political ones or the demonstrated economic ones, how does that change how you view global events? How does it shift your perspective on who really holds the levers of influence?
Definitely a lot to think about there. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it's given you some fresh perspectives, maybe a new lens to look through as you watch the world unfold.